everyone, this is Amanda Moore from the Angelman Syndrome Foundation, and you're listening to the ASF Podcast, the show that explains everything you want to know about Angelman Syndrome. We're so excited you're here, and we hope you enjoy the show. Okay, guys, welcome to another edition of the Angelman Syndrome Foundation podcast. And I'm incredibly excited tonight to be with several of my two really great friends, but also amazing colleagues here at the Angelman Syndrome Foundation. So I would love for you all to welcome Catherine and Liz to our podcast. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh. So tonight we're all about newly diagnosed 101. Keep in mind it's late, so we're all tired. We're all Angelman mamas. So we're going to do our best to get through this together, but this might just be more of a funny episode for everyone to listen to. So we'll see how it goes. But let's start off by, for those people, there are, people who are listening to our podcast right now are people who've already been diagnosed, or people that may have stumbled on our podcast, or some that may think, hey, I think that my child may have Angelman syndrome, or that mother and father that may have just been diagnosed today or yesterday or just recently. So tonight is all about that journey. But let's start off because some of those people out there may not know who my guests are. So Catherine, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your newly diagnosed journey?
Sure. So my name is Catherine Ely, and I have a son, Stetson, who is 9, who is diagnosed. Actually, we're recording this on October 3rd, and he was diagnosed exactly 8 years ago today.
Wow.
So I know it's one of those days that you never forget. And however, it's not one of those days that I grieve anymore. Stetson developed pretty typically up until about 8 to 10 months old, and we started noticing some delays. He had his first set of seizures at like 15 months old, we think because illness spawned it, and they started genetic testing. So we kind of had this little period of ignorance, I guess. And then we started with the seizures, with the developmental delays, signaled there was something else going on. So that led to our diagnosis. We were told multiple times, like I think many people in the community are, that Stetson was fine. He was a boy. He was an only child. He would catch up. And that led us to believe them. We were, new parents. We did not have any other children at the time. He's our oldest. We do now. We have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. So it's fun for him to have siblings. But I think if I could tell anyone looking back, kind of our key moment, I guess, is that, we had never heard of Angelman syndrome before. It was 8 years ago. And now here we are, and we dove right into the community. We got involved with the Angelman Syndrome Foundation immediately. We researched, we reached out. We've developed incredible friendships. We've celebrated some of the highest of highs. We've, had some pretty low periods that sometimes weren't even connected to Angelman syndrome. But it's been a journey for sure. And I am so honored that I get to share our journey and be a part of this amazing community.
I love it. There's a couple of things that you said in your introduction that I want to come back to that I think really resonate with those who are experiencing getting a diagnosis. But let's go over to Liz. And Liz, if you can introduce yourself and share a little bit of the same stuff.
Sure. I'm Liz Gelazzo. I am the Chief Medical Officer for the Angelman Syndrome Foundation, but I ended up there because my amazing second child, my second daughter, Evelyn, was diagnosed with Angelman syndrome. Very similarly to your story, Catherine, right around her first birthday. And we also just passed that milestone, diagnosis day milestone, and, her 8th birthday just this past week, and all the emotions, complex emotions and memories that certainly brings. Evelyn was diagnosed, like I said, right around her first birthday. I was a practicing pediatrician at the time that she was born, and I was pretty sure that there was something going on with Evelyn really pretty early after delivery, honestly. Um, she was my second, and um, she just had a different cry than I expected her to have, and a cry that I had, come to associate with other children that I had cared for that had neurological syndromes or disorders. And I really wondered from very early on whether there was something going on neurologically. Um, I was pretty, I think I was already kind of, tuned in to being hyper vigilant about this and, started bringing up concerns to our pediatrician really early on, by a month of life, she was already having really significant difficulties feeding. By 2 months, I was worried, about delayed development, but I really couldn't convince anybody else to be worried about any of this. I was really struggling to get our pediatrician to believe that there was, something more serious than maybe just reflux or feeding issues going on. So, fast forward several months, and on her 9 month well visit, I finally told our pediatrician we have to see a developmental specialist. And we were fortunately able to be seen quickly, and they shared my concerns and ordered the appropriate testing. And then, very similar to Stetson, Evelyn started having seizures in about 16 months. And so, in a lot of ways, that was kind of the moment for me. That was kind of the final straw that I was just kind of waiting for. We knew that there was, such a high frequency of children with Angelman syndrome that had seizures, and that was kind of like, the last blow, so to speak, for me. So since then, we've been, as Catherine mentioned, very much the same on this journey. We jumped right in to the community, to the Angelman Syndrome Foundation, got involved as a board member originally, focused on helping some of the work that we were doing to establish clinics at the time in 2017, and then eventually came on staff at the Angelman Syndrome Foundation in 2019 to lead some of the clinical efforts of the Angelman Syndrome Foundation. As I mentioned, she's my middle, so I have a neurotypical 9-year-old or now 10 years old, older sister who is Evelyn's greatest champion, and a neurotypical 5-year-old younger brother who is Evelyn's greatest challenger. Most of what Evelyn does is try to keep up and beat Charlie. So that's a really great motivation for her. But it is certainly a journey. And I think if I could go back, I was reflecting on this just this past week as, we were thinking about her birthday and just thinking about all the emotions that we were feeling on her first birthday when she had just been diagnosed. We were, fresh into diagnosis, like maybe a month at the time of her birthday. And if I could just go back, I don't know that anybody in the world could have convinced me how okay things would ultimately turn out. But if I could just somehow go back and, give myself that grace and compassion and reassurance that this was all going to be okay, that, our family was going to be okay, Evelyn was going to be okay, that this journey would be okay. It would be challenging, but so incredibly rewarding. If I could convince myself to believe that back then, would have saved me a lot of heartache for sure.
I think that's a lot of stuff that comes up when we talk about the newly diagnosed process of like all those things that we know now that we wish we would have known then, that like handling that journey and handling that news and handling the first seizure, handling the first constipation, whatever it may be, there may be a little bit more grace and compassion and not as much fear. You guys both talked a lot about like the grief process, and I've shared my story before, so I won't get into it because I don't want to take too much time, but I, Catherine mentioned like she can still kind of remember it like it was yesterday. And I remember like when I talk to new families and they ask me about like our diagnosis process, the one thing that totally sticks out to me is just the moment I heard Angelman syndrome for the first time. It's like that's frozen in my head. And anytime I think about it, I remember the smell of the hospital, because we were in the hospital because Jackson had his first seizure and we had no clue what was going on. And I remember the smell of the hospital. I remember that I was sitting in a chair and Jackson was sitting in my lap. And I was bawling, and I could almost feel myself coming out of my body and looking down. And I could see my husband being so strong and asking all the questions to the neurologist, and me just looking at myself and thinking, like, what the heck just happened? Like, this was not the life that I expected. This isn't the life I ordered. Like, what is happening? And remember just that moment in time so much. And Liz, you brought up, like, you wish you could go back and tell yourself like what you know now, because, you know, the one thing I tell new families all the time is that for us, at least, and we have to respect that everyone has their different journey when it comes to Angelman syndrome. So, but for us, in our experience, we have far more better days with Angelman syndrome than we have bad days. But the bad days can be really, really hard. And the diagnosis day is one of those days that it's just really, really hard to get past that process and that grief that you feel when you hear that word. I don't know if either one of you experienced that or remember that at all.
I remember, like you said, everything. For us, Stetson's first seizure, which was 2 months before his or 6 weeks before his actual diagnosis, that's the day that I feel like our whole world changed. And we would never go back to what we thought was normal. Yeah. But then same thing. I mean, we got our genetic testing report back at our neurologist office, and she was so lovely. And you hear stories of just horror stories of some doctors and how they present what Angelman syndrome can be. And all she kept saying, and this is what I think set us off on the right foot, was she just kept saying how hopeful she was, hopeful she was for Stetson, how great he was doing, how great he looked, and that's all she said. I mean, that was the one word, if I could take back. And we're so fortunate to have that, because that's not what everyone has. And I recognize that. But the fact that today kind of, again, it was 8 years ago today, we sat in that office. The fact that today came and went, and we were almost like, oh, this happened. I think is huge. And not to take away from that day. I mean, we all, like you said, we can go back and remember every second, but here we are 8 years later. And I was like, oh yeah, Matt, my husband, like, this is what happened. And our whole world changed upside down. You know, I was a teacher at the time. I stopped working after he was diagnosed, like so many moms that we now talk to, or parents, or whoever it might be, trying to figure out childcare and trying to figure out, you know, therapy schedules and getting into everything. And, you know, it's just everyone's path is so different. But like Liz said, you know, I can't imagine what my life would be like if it didn't include the two of y'all, if it didn't include Stetson, how he is. And, you know, learning to celebrate things that you never thought you would celebrate, you know, like my
poop,
8-year-old,
like poop. Yes. Let's be real.
Like the one, the dump he took in the toilet today, that we were like, yeah. Or like my 9-year-old eating with a fork, and not well, but it was, you learn to celebrate and your life just pivots, and you also realize what's not important anymore.
Yes, amen to that. I always say that Evelyn has shown us, she has really shifted our, you know, expectations of what is important, right? I completely agree with everything that you all have said. I tell newly diagnosed families this often, that I can in earnest say that Angelman syndrome, while it has certainly brought challenging days into our life, I do honestly believe it has made our life better. I believe that, you know, we see life in a different way. We see the beauty in the small things. We see, you know, we appreciate the small things. We appreciate these tiny milestones. We appreciate these things that, as, you know, the parent of a neurotypical kiddo only, you know, before Evelyn, I didn't necessarily stop to appreciate, right? I didn't marvel at development I certainly marveled at the typical development of our youngest in a completely different way, right?
Yeah.
After seeing how hard it is for Evelyn to reach all those milestones that we certainly celebrate the heck out of, but it's just shown us, to slow down, that we don't
Yeah.
have control over this
Yeah.
world, which is good for some of us type A
Yeah.
moms to appreciate,
Yes.
right? That like we don't have control. And you know what? I no longer care if I've completely lost control
That's
of all the
okay.
laundry.
Right.
That's okay.
Yeah.
That's
It's
not an
funny
important thing in life anymore.
today. Like it's one of those small things. Like today, for all summer, we were like, we are going to get Jackson to use a straw and use a cup that doesn't require plastic nipple because he just went through them. Like, I think we could literally take stock out in like the Nook bottles because we just were buying them like crazy and he would just chew them. And tonight we stopped in the craziness of everything that happens in the day or the week or the month. And we stopped and looked at each other and we were like, oh my gosh. We didn't celebrate that we were working so hard to get him off that. And he did it the other day. I mean, he's using a straw like a boss. And now like when he uses a cup, it's not the chewy ones anymore. It's the hard ones. And he's finally doing it. So it's little things like that. I never thought that I would celebrate that. But oh my gosh, we were looked at each other today and we're like, we did it. Like, not we, all of us, like Jackson, Adam,
for real,
our therapist, everyone,
yeah.
but we did it. And we met that milestone, not thinking we figured we eventually would, but man, he did it and he did it well. And now we can move forward. And it's one of those things where you look back on those moments of like, oh my gosh, like we're going to get through this. It's going to be all good. Right. But yeah, the little things we celebrate.
But that also brings up a good point. Like I feel like with Stetson not being diagnosed until he was 17 months old, we didn't know any different for those, 15, 17 months old. So, for us, certain things like, well, he was supposed to transition off of a bottle at 1. So I took him off of that particular one, not a sippy cup, and it was like we learned at a young age. And then that was one of when we went to Gainesville and saw Dr. Williams, one of the best pieces of advice he could have ever given us that I still tell parents as well is you still hold your child to that same standard of any other child that yours or whatnot, neurotypical children, and they will surprise the heck out of you.
Yeah.
Like tonight, Amanda, y'all said you just did that and he's fine. Like he surprised you. He lived up to your expectation. And I think that's something important too, is that our children are so smart and adults are
wicked
so smart and
yeah.
so able to adapt. I think that Stetson has the ability to adapt. And I know this isn't for every child, but better than my 3-year-old for sure.
He's had to, right? He's had to develop those problem solving skills because his body doesn't work the same way, right? And he can't communicate the same way. And so instead of having a tantrum, he's had to figure out another way to communicate that need, right? Yep. So I think the problem solving skills are really quite remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So go ahead, Catherine.
I was going to say, I applaud you for holding Jackson. You all set a date, you set a time, you were going to do it. And look at him. He's
Damn
like,
it.
All right,
we were going to do it. I was not going to go out and buy another one of those cups if it was the last thing I did. So Liz, for anyone who's listening, who may have stumbled on this, who, is thinking that their child may have Angelman syndrome or is, they have been told or whatever, for just briefly, if you can tell us a little bit of what are some of the first signs or the first kind of symptoms that people should, maybe look out for when it comes to Angelman syndrome?
Yeah, so these early signs that are clues for Angelman syndrome are not necessarily specific to Angelman syndrome. A lot of these things that we see in that first year of life are common to other genetic disorders as well. So, this is far from specific, but oftentimes children with Angelman syndrome will have feeding difficulties. It's a pretty common theme. You'll hear about babies that just couldn't figure out how to nurse, couldn't really figure out how to coordinate that suck and swallow effectively, even with a bottle. Oftentimes I hear from families that they're having to use multiple, they've tried every different nipple that was ever made. And, there might be one very specific one. That is the only one that their child will take. And these problems often wax and wane throughout the first year of life, and they typically get better in that second year of life. Of course, every kid is different. Those early motor milestones like rolling, sitting, things like that are often delayed as well. That's often one of those first signs that kind of gets the pediatrician thinking, is there something else going on here? And might, make a referral to early intervention services, by 6-9 months because of the lack of rolling well and trying to sit up on their own. And then, around that time, oftentimes we'll notice the lack of true babbling, right? You might be hearing like raspberries and making other cooing sounds, but the lack of that true like ma, 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 ba, 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 da, 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 those sort of sounds. All of that, around 9 months, I would say 9 to 12 months is kind of what I think is often the final straw. Paired with this, oftentimes what we see is this just really pleasant, happy demeanor. These babies that are very easy to smile and giggle and seem very sociable, because they are. That kind of combination of features oftentimes will drive the initial workup. But I will say very, very rarely do I see the initial workup being targeted at Angelman syndrome. So, it's not like the pediatrician says, oh, yes, I recognize this immediately. And I will tell you, even astute geneticists won't say, that child walks in the room and they say, oh, of course, this child has Angelman syndrome, right? It happens sometimes that a clinician is suspicious specifically for Angelman syndrome, but most of the time, there's a recognition that this child is not meeting milestones, perhaps his failure to thrive, perhaps, the expressive language delays are more disproportionate to everything else. And that drives this workup, this kind of generic workup up front. But fortunately for kids with Angelman syndrome, most kids, about 75% of kids with Angelman syndrome will have a deletion, and that's picked up on the microarray, which is oftentimes one of the first tier of tests that's done for children with developmental delay.
Hey guys, it's Amanda here. As you know, we're here for you, our community. If you have questions about any topics we can discuss in our podcast, or if you have ideas for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. All you need to do is email me at dearamanda@angelman.org. Thank you so much for listening and your continued support of the Angelman Syndrome Foundation. So either one of you can answer this, but I'm a newly diagnosed parent. And what would you say, what's the piece of advice you would give him as what your first step should be? Like, what are those first things that you want to start looking into and doing as a now parent of an individual with Angelman syndrome?
I mean, first and foremost is, again, all of the grace, all of the compassion, like connecting with family, connecting, with loved ones, like really giving yourself a minute to breathe and adjust to this news. We talk about this a lot. This is a really huge pill to swallow, right? This diagnosis is a lot when people start, when you're first reading about it. Dr. Google is a terrible black hole. Don't go there. That's the first advice don't Google, right? Because the internet's always going to represent the most severe cases, right? Or the outlier cases. And so it's always challenging to parse out what's, kind of the most severe end of the spectrum versus what really day-to-day life looks like. That's impossible to figure out on Google, right? So, I mean, again, that first is, I feel like for some families that's weeks, for some families that's months, for some families that, I don't know, are bionic, that seems like 48 hours before they're ready to jump in and meet other families and start finding, building their clinician team. I mean, for us personally, I feel like this took weeks before we were ready to really start to trudge forward after that initial diagnosis.
Yeah, I think that everyone, it's so different, right? And so I think the other thing is that, for us at least, we had already been, even though we didn't get our diagnosis until Jackson was 2, we had already been in early intervention. So we were doing PT and OT and those things that are important. But for those, if there are people that are out there that get the diagnosis and haven't been connected to therapy yet, that's definitely something we would suggest early on, is getting your solid therapy team around you and get those services started.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think, and now things have changed in early intervention too. And so get evaluated if you feel like it's worth your time. I know, like, we're in Georgia and it's just different than it was 8 years ago. It's a lot of parent-led, hands-on and not as much therapist-led, and that can be hard for some parents. But just getting involved in some way and creating space for what this is going to look like. You don't need to think. And I think we were one of those weird people who jumped right in like 48 hours later. And I think it's because it was so unknown to us. And it's different. Again, 8 years later, it's totally different. People know what Angelman syndrome is, kind of. And there's a community, and there's ways to connect. Like even this, and Amanda's so available for everyone. It's different, but that feeling of connection, whether we had met a family, that didn't happen until like a year later, but just knowing that there were some sort of resources. And for us, it was figuring out a way for us to get to a clinic as soon as possible. And just to hear that here's someone who deals with Angelman syndrome and treats kids and all day long, or adults with AS all day long, to hear them say you are doing a fantastic job and you're doing everything right, because we were at that point. We had them in therapies, and we were seeing specialists, and we were reaching out. That was worth the money, the time, the effort, the time off of work, just to know and kind of get that sense of relief and being able to take a breath and being like, okay, we're on the right track and we will be okay.
That's a great point. When we were ready to trudge forward, I do think that, one of the first really powerful stops for us was the UNC clinic. Catherine, I think y'all came to the UNC clinic first too, right? Yeah.
We went to
honestly
Gainesville and then there.
Oh, right. You saw the legendary Dr. Williams first. Well, we didn't feel like ready to bite off the whole clinic day of like seeing every specialist. I don't know. I also lived in denial of like reading a test report for multiple years of my life. So you and I are different. I really, what we were so focused on at that time was really like communication. How do we foster an environment at home that is going to be conducive to her and our whole family learning this whole other, language of communication. And so we actually trekked down to UNC just to see the speech language pathologist, Margaret Doremus. And it was exactly that, right? Like somebody who knew Angelman syndrome, who was saying, you're doing a great job. She looks great. Here are your next steps. And here's why I know that they're going to work, because, I've seen hundreds of other children who have been successful using this model, right? Like that was really powerful for us in the beginning. And, what area we focused on kind of shifted as she got bigger and older and the needs changed, right? I mean, for a while during that second year of life, it was seizure management and seeing a neurologist who was really well-versed in Angelman syndrome seizures through the clinic network was equally important, right? I mean, that was pretty transformative in our journey to feel like, as a clinician myself, I wanted somebody else to be the decision maker in the room, right? Because oftentimes, even if you're not a clinician parent, you are an expert in your child's disease, and the doctor oftentimes is going to look to you to make these decisions. I just wanted somebody else that knew and would make the decisions for me, right? I just didn't want to be the decision maker. And so that was a really important role that the clinic served very early on. And again, have shifted throughout her life. We've seen different specialists, we've leaned on different specialists within the clinic at different times when our needs were different, if that makes sense.
It's so funny because I think this is a great example about how everyone's journey is so vastly different. But that's a good thing, because then we can grow and learn from each other. But when we were diagnosed, like, my immediate thought wasn't clinical care. My immediate thought went to, what do I need to do to raise awareness and find a treatment to better the life of my child? Like, that's what my mind went to. Like, what do I need to do? So I reached out, I, just like you guys, reached out to the Angelman Syndrome Foundation to learn more about what was happening, and said, like, listen, I'm going to get lost in this grief. If I don't do something, this is the way that I operate as an individual. Like, if I don't do something, I think I'll get lost in it. And I need to be proactive of making sure Jackson has the best life possible, whatever that may look like, that he has a quality of life that, that is solid for him. And so, I immediately reached out and literally was on the board 2 weeks later. And my whole focus was, okay, I'm going to be a walk coordinator. Done. I'm going to be on the board. Check. I'm going to, start trying to raise advocacy in Indiana about the importance of, access and whatever. Check. Working on that. So it was one of those things where, like, I think we all operate so differently in the grief or in the process of getting that diagnosis. But what's funny, and what is so beautiful as well, we all end up walking each other's journey in some ways, because we then, when the times were really hard for us with Jackson, we leaned on the clinics hard, and praise God, because if we didn't, we would have been, a lot of things would have happened with Jackson that didn't. Didn't happen because of the clinics. But it's just so interesting that everyone processes differently, and everyone's first steps in this journey can be vastly different. But we all tend to walk this, the same footprints eventually, which I think is so remarkable about this community.
And not only that, I think, we all have to look at where we are in our lives too, and how that impacts your reaction to the diagnosis. We had an only child. It was just my husband. It was just Matt and I and Stetson. We didn't have an older child at home or a twin sibling at the same time. And I think that that's really important to recognize too, that you do what you can. And one thing that I feel like ASF is doing such a great job at is meeting families where they're at. If you need help talking to an older sibling about Angelman syndrome and what it is and what this means, we've created something for that. If you need a book to reach out and try and help explain it to children, that's something too. But for us, we didn't have to think about other children or another living being when we were going through this. And I think that probably made it easier for us to jump right in. But, if you're navigating a whole family, it's like Liz said, I think that one of the takeaways here is grace. Just have a lot of it. Give yourself a lot of it, and continue to, year after year, day after day, because you're going to have the most amazing days for sure. And you're going to have some really hard days that sometimes sneak up on you and you don't realize it and you don't know where it comes from. And you need to be able to rely back on that grace that you gave yourself however long ago when you got the diagnosis.
Well, and I think another part of that is, early on, like when you do get the diagnosis, start really searching out and building your village and your community around you. I'm going to be incredibly transparent, and there's probably people that are going to be listening to this that may be a part of this, but and it may be hard for other families to hear, but it also may be something that people really resonate with as well. But the people that were in our lives before diagnosis, 90% of them are not in our lives anymore. And that's, for me, that's been something that Adam and I have really had to journey through and work through, because by no fault of Jackson whatsoever, because none of this falls on Jackson at all. But when we got the diagnosis, our lives just changed a little bit. We look at things differently. We make different choices and different decisions. Now, keep in mind, we also had twins at the time. So coming to our house was just freaking chaos anyway, right? But, we try to work really hard at the beginning of establishing those few people we knew we were going to be able to count on and building that village around us. And it did get smaller, and that's heartbreaking, honestly. And that's just me being transparent. I look around, and a lot of people that were in my life before are not. But you know what? There are people in my life now, like you two and other people, that I would have never experienced if it wasn't for Angelman syndrome. And they're part of my village. They're who I reach out to, and they're who I connect with, and they're who are there to support me and help me in those times that I do need extra grace, because I'm not giving myself grace at all. So in the very beginning, really, establishing that village and that community, I think, is essential as well. But also being okay with and not being so hard on yourself when you look around and some of those people aren't there anymore. I know sometimes Adam and I look at each other and we're like, do people just not want to be around us? Like, did we do something? Like, what was our role in some of this? And I think that with everything in life, there are seasons. And then I also believe very much so that people are brought into your lives for a reason, and situations are brought into your life for a reason. And I just think that the people that are a part of our lives now and that are a part of our village are so remarkable that I wouldn't trade the situation from the world. But having that village is very crucial.
Yeah, I was going to say the flip side of that, while the village might be smaller, it's an incredibly empowering, heartening village, right? I mean, I think one of the things that's been most rewarding to me is seeing those people that are there really step up. And I know, a lot of us are in the same boat of really struggling to ask for help, right? And not being good at asking for help, not being good at saying, I need something, or even telling people what would make life easier. But seeing those people who do stick around, really, work to be a part of your kid with a disability's life, I think is really amazing. And seeing their kids grow into humans who, learn the value of everyone's life, that disabled lives matter as much, and are as valuable as non-disabled lives. I think I have been continually humbled by that journey of watching that village grow around us, and what those other humans are learning, and what we are all learning. I don't know. I think that's been a really rewarding part of this.
Absolutely. So we only have a few more minutes together, but I wanted to ask Catherine. Catherine, since you are our family resource director, for someone who's newly diagnosed, what are some of the things that we do have at the ASF that can be really helpful tools and resources for them? Obviously there's tons throughout the journey, but specifically for newly diagnosed.
So many things. One, I will say that, if you go to our website and you start to look at everything that we do offer, it can be overwhelming for newly diagnosed. So I'd start small and look at the newly diagnosed tab for resources. The three of us do a webinar every other month. And
I was going to say, don't forget our webinar.
Right.
No, our
webinars. Join us on our webinar.
It's almost as fun as this.
The most fun. It is. It is.
Fun,
we actually get to interact with the other people, though.
Yes. We got very serious tonight. But
yeah, we go through our host, but I think that is something, it's been consistent to have, it's been fun. I guess it's probably not the right word, but good to see the consistent families that come on who literally were diagnosed. I think, when was the last time we did it? And there was someone who was diagnosed like 3 days before we had that webinar. Wow. And I just look back and I'm like, man, if we had that right when we were newly diagnosed, how much my feelings of being, I guess, I don't know, in a community immediately, or knowing how to navigate this system journey, whatever we want to call it. But the newly diagnosed webinar, I think, is the huge thing. It's every other month, and you can register on our website. And there is the 100 days, your first 100 days of diagnosis. And I think that that's really important to look at, and because it breaks things up into small chunks for you, because this can just, when you start to think of all the things that maybe you should be doing, and I do this at 8 years in, I still have the days where I'm like, God, I'm not doing this enough. I'm not working on communication hard enough. I'm not doing this. And it's just a rabbit hole to go down. So if you look at that first 100 days, then you can see, just how to do little bit by little bit, break it off piece by piece. We have groups for siblings. There's a lot, but I think an important thing to do is to reach out maybe even to one of the three of us.
Yes.
And ask for help. Maybe one of my biggest pieces of advice would be like, don't be afraid to be vulnerable, and don't be afraid to reach out with any questions. When you're new off the bat with this, there are no questions and Liz and I, we all talk, we are open books about this. And I will honestly answer anything that you throw my way, and hope that you do take this open invitation to talk to you or your family or, whoever it might be. But start small with what we have, because there's a lot, and find your place within. If you look to the ASF for resources and programs and whatnot,
and we can
the number one thing I think is the webinar.
Yeah. And we can also, I think there's a couple of other things to mention. Obviously, we have family champions in every state that we can connect you with. If there's just that one person in your state that you want to talk with, we can do that. And then the other thing I think that's very unique to the rare disease space is that we also have an amazing counselor that is free to anyone in the family that, once you receive this diagnosis, if you just need to talk through and process it and, process your grief and go through that. She's amazing. I think she has probably spoken at this point to at least 400 families in our community. She's very well versed in the rare disease space, and she's unbelievable, and she's free. And so that service is on our website as well. And if that's your first step, if that's what you want to do, that service is open to you as well. And I would really suggest it, because I think it's really good to talk through that. Absolutely. But yes, our website can be overwhelming because it has so many wonderful resources, but Catherine and Liz and myself are more than happy at any time to step out and have conversations with you and help you through that. So ladies, we're going to close up here, but we've kind of already talked about this, but I want to just end this conversation with, one more time, biggest piece of advice you want people to know from your perspective as newly diagnosed to leave with, what would that be? Liz, we'll start with you.
Find your people. Find your people. Find your people. That's really all I have to say. Find your people. The people are so important to this journey. I can't recommend at least just having one other mom, and it doesn't actually, or dad, one other caregiver. It doesn't have to be another parent of a child with Angelman syndrome, even just your person who gets it on the good days, on the bad days. Sometimes it feels weird to text best friends who have neurotypical kids when you're celebrating something as silly as a poop, but you want somebody who can really enjoy that with you, and also that you can gripe to on the bad days and not feel bad about it either. So find your person that gets it and hold on to that person.
Yeah. I have to say, Catherine, before you go, I have to share, I don't know if you two know this, but the most ironic story is that my college roommate for years, super close, super great friends, love her so much. But she has a daughter named Brooklyn, who ended up getting diagnosed with Rett syndrome years before Jackson. So she has a daughter who has Rett syndrome, which I won't even get into trying to explain to everyone what that is. But that's a really, really hard, rare disease. that affects primarily girls. Is that correct? But there are boys, but is it primarily girls, right?
Yes. Yes.
And then her son, Boston, was born and ended up having Down syndrome and severe autism. So she has 2 children who she's a full-time caregiver for. And all of this before Jackson was diagnosed. And so the first person I called when we got the diagnosis was Kelly. And I'm like, Kelly, like, you will never believe. Because I remember thinking so many times after I got off the phone with Kelly, like, I don't know how she does it. If that was ever me, I would totally fail. I wouldn't be able to survive. Like, she's unbelievable. And literally, like, she's the one I typically call a lot now because she gets it. She's a mom with a rare disease, maybe not AS, but she understands it. So I just think that's so odd that my college roommate ended up having such the same journey as I have in some ways. So this world becomes very, very, very small when you're in the rare disease space. So, okay, sorry, Catherine, what about you?
No. Well, building upon what Liz said, I would also just encourage you to take time and take it in and then figure out your best kind of steps forward. So, you're going to have hard days and it's okay. Feel those emotions. Go through that process and that grief and in the stages that you need to go through. And like I said, sometimes it might knock you down when you least expect it. You think you're doing well and something comes up and you need to run out of the room or whatever it might be. But don't live in that space of being hurt. Figure out a way, find someone, like Liz said and Amanda said, to kind of help you in that time. Because if you're going to experience so much joy, just make sure you allow yourself to do it.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that too, I think it's also, I tell a lot of families sometimes too, like, it's okay to live in the grief too, like, stay in it, absorb it, but find ways to pull yourself out of it, because that can be a really hard and lonely place to be. And so I think both of you said finding your tribe, finding your people who can support you through this, I think, is essential. And hopefully those of you that were listening will see ASF and myself, Liz and Catherine, as a part of that village community tribe that can support you through this journey. Liz and Catherine, thank you so much for being on with me tonight. I always love doing these podcasts with you. If you're newly diagnosed and listening to us now and have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to info@angelman.org, or you can always send me a question at dearamanda@angelman.org. We're excited to have our next podcast will be coming up soon. We're going to be talking from everything from toilet training to AAC devices to what the heck is an ASO. So stay tuned for our next podcast. Catherine and Liz, thank you so much and have a great night.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the ASF podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support us, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating or review. And please don't forget to subscribe.